Thank you very much, Rasmus, first and foremost, and Federica for inviting me. And it's been a pleasure. I've worked with Rasmus on a number of occasions over the years, and I have been a part of this Insight project that I'm going to talk about in a minute. That was said by Pascal Brisset, who's going to also be talking today. That was a 5-year project funded by the European Commission Horizon 2020 program. And that was about, I'm going to briefly talk about that, to science diplomacy. And my part in that was working on the intersection of geopolitics, specifically critical geopolitics, mediation and communication, and science diplomacy in relation to the Arctic. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, the case study I did for that project. To briefly introduce where I'm coming from in terms of a paradigm and sort of a study field, a research field. It is critical geopolitics, and it was basically, it became very prominent in the 1990s after especially the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union. And this is not to sort of negate or deny the importance of real geopolitics, but this was a paradigm in a research field that was putting the emphasis on that we cannot think about geopolitics only in terms of international relations, political relations, but we need to take into consideration other factors such as media communication and the ways in which communication and relations internationally, intergovernmentally, and in the public sphere taking place. So that's sort of the context that I'm coming from. It's basically, it's concerned with the geographical assumptions. Just read the definition here, and designations that underlie the making of world politics, which is always shaping and reshaping itself. The goal of critical geopolitics is to elucidate and explain how political actors spatialize international politics and represented as a world characterized by particular types of places. And more so, mediation, communication, as we all know and witness, became very important in these kinds of relations. And the case study I did for this particular project, Insight, it's an abbreviation for inventing a shared science diplomacy for Europe, was about the Arctic Council's communication of science and how they used it on social media, because they had a declaration basically themselves to make it a mission to expand their communication and mediation efforts using social media, and particularly Twitter at the time. Now it's called X, as we all know. But to again briefly read this, what my point was in this case study and in relation to this project was that techno-deterministic and techno-romantic, and I'm going to go into these very soon briefly to stay within the time limit, understandings of the role of companies such as Facebook, Twitter, again, X now, have ascribed to these platforms powerful transformative roles in processes of social change. So it became sort of like a mandate, almost like compulsory for many institutions, organizations to use these platforms to communicate whatever they are doing and whatever their mission is. However, yes, I have been critical about this in my case study and my other work. Recent research has emphasized the need to analyze their influence within broader social, economic, and political contexts. It is necessary to consider the platform's place within broadcast media ecologies, media ecologies, the actual levels to which users employ the platforms to bypass established media outlets. That is also very important to emphasize here. We had traditional media, what is also called legacy media, before that, like journalism, etc., TV, and then it came in social media. To bypass media outlets. And it is called disintermediation, and I'm going to go into that term and explain that as well during the talk. And whether mere presence online translates into use and impact. With these issues in mind, I examined, in this case, the Arctic Council's social media use in the service of science communication, its benefits and limits, and the place of social media in the broader science diplomacy, media ecology. Media ecology is another term that I'm going to go into soon. So to briefly go into science diplomacy, of course, we're all aware of what it is, but I'm going to use two quotes, one this and in the next slide. Also, it's always been a vague term, actually. It has been defined in different ways. But to quote from Oakes, Pullman, and Ordanius Matamoros, a description of very specific mechanisms in some situations. And they say, we believe its essence lies at the interface between foreign policy and science. This might include the activities of diplomats, policymakers, scientists, research managers, lobbyists, and others whose day-to-day working lives cross national borders. This is not just a question of nations. International ties between regions and cities or cities can be equally valid aspects of science diplomacy. And this next research, it's been actually very key in this particular case study. He defines it as science for diplomacy, describes the soft power approach. States follow through strengthening their scientific capabilities, achieving additional attraction, and in consequence, developing the availability to shape preferences and policies. Most prominently, cooperation agreements and the creation of institutions are used as an instrument to promote deeper political ties through scientific collaboration. And the Arctic Council serves as a good example, that was sort of one of my starting points in this case study, for this dimension, as the cooperation on environmental protection within the Arctic environmental protection strategy in consequence led to the foundation of the Arctic Council in 1996. So the Arctic Council and science diplomacy, as many of us know here, May 2017, foreign ministers of the 8 states who have the shore to the Arctic, with Arctic territories, signed the agreement in enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation at Arctic Council in Fairbanks, Alaska. And this agreement enhanced the logistic capacity for cross-cutting knowledge, discovery and application, and is one of the latest iterations of science diplomacy. So my case was communication from the Arctic Council on the topic of science and scientific cooperation is analyzed with an eye toward not only addressing the benefits and limits of media, in particular social media use in the service of science communication, and the place of social media in the broader science diplomacy, media ecology. Media ecology is another term that I'm going to go into, but also the asymmetries in knowledge and information awareness. So who are the protagonists here, weighing the relative amounts of power different protagonists, in this case, have in relation to the mediated communication in question and to its filtering into the public sphere, because that's what I was concerned and researched here, public sphere, science diplomacy, and how this is communicated. Social media platforms, the Arctic Council itself, of course, members of the scientific community, external stakeholders, media companies, and what nowadays we call big tech, and the general population, that is the citizens and communities. who are the biggest social stakeholders, of course. And what are the stakes? Use of social media by the Arctic Council for communication of scientific research and cooperation in the service of science diplomacy, and the relationship between that aspect to citizenship and governance. But what is important to emphasize here is low levels of discussion or interaction, which begs the question, what is being missed through these low levels? What does the Arctic Council see as the ultimate purpose of the communication of scientific cooperation using public channels beyond simple internal communication? Because one issue here is communicating to a niche community, to science community and those who are in the business of, in the field of science diplomacy, but how is this reaching to the public sphere, to the public, who are, again, the biggest stakeholders here? And how debate on social media platforms can often degenerate into aggressive nationalistic narratives that can not only stray away from the original purpose of the post, but can possibly undermine them. I mean, trolling and nowadays, of course, with artificial intelligence and all of that coming into play, this is a key issue, and how this plays into science communication and science diplomacy. And this is from the Arctic Council's communication strategy itself, as they published it. They said one of the Arctic Council's primary purposes is to disseminate information, encourage education, and promote interest in Arctic-related issues. And that in the face of an ever-shifting communications landscape, which it is shifting very rapidly, the Arctic Council communication strategy will guide the Council towards generating positive narratives on Arctic cooperation, environmental protection, sustainable development, and the well-being of Arctic residents. And they continued, the target audiences for Council's communication, that's how they started their social media communication: inhabitants of the Arctic and Arctic states, Arctic Council network, policymakers in Arctic states and observer states, Arctic-focused NGOs, IPOs, that is indigenous populations organizations, and IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, Arctic scientific and research community, business sectors with interest in the Arctic, youth, and they emphasize this specifically, including students from the Arctic and from Arctic states, media representatives, and the general public. So my case study looked into how this materialized using the kind of communication they use on social media. They identified digital media networks, including social media, as serving to amplify messaging, research key audiences, to reach key audiences, notably opinion leaders, journalists, and youth. Again, that was very much emphasized. So they used Facebook. They created that in 2014. They had 10,000 plus followers, Twitter, Instagram, Flickr, Vimeo, and SoundCloud. But social media content with explicit reference to science and research, scientific researchers, research, and those were the kinds of keywords that I used when I was looking at social media and how they were posting information about these issues, made up a relatively narrow portion of the social media content examined. It wasn't really prominent, which kind of goes against what they were sort of starting out to put out there, their mission. A total of 3,000 plus tweets were sent by the Council between May 2017 and 2021, of which only 198, that is 6%, contained the relevant keywords about science, scientific research, science diplomacy, etc. So interest in the posts with specific terms motivated by the fact that Arctic Council made reference to groups such as journalists, as youths, or youth as being targets of social media communication, groups falling outside of scientists, diplomats, experts, and other insiders who would be more informed about Arctic Council activities, thus less in need of specified terminology. So again, the communication was very much sort of like targeting a niche audience who were already informed about what was happening, but not necessarily reaching the public sphere and the target groups as they specified it. So examples of forms of content, I looked at their posts online. That was promotion and communication of Arctic Council and related subdivisions, scientific meetings and gatherings, promotion and communication of the Arctic Council in general is a venue for scientific collaboration, which is basically PR, public relations, linking science diplomacy and indigenous issues, promoting the expansion of science diplomacy in the Arctic beyond traditional Arctic borders. But there were very low levels of engagement, actually. So for posts from the Arctic Council marked by relatively low level of interaction defined on Twitter as retweets, because they're important. Social media, as we all know, it's its own sort of like logic. Retweets, reposts are important, and it was very low level, so it wasn't really reaching the targeted audiences and users. For example, 57% of Arctic Circle tweets on science and science diplomacy had fewer than 10 retweets. So it wasn't really reaching very much beyond that limit. And these were the most tweeted and retweeted posts. This one on the left, the Arctic Council marks a special occasion on, this was about agreement on enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation. The other one was about epidemiologist Dr. Anders Koch about his research and a newly, at the time, newly signed Arctic Science Agreement. So these were the most tweeted and retweeted posts. And in relation to science and indigenous communities, since they made it a mission for themselves to reach out to indigenous communities, these were, again, of course, the previous slide and this one, I mean, there are overlapping sort of tweets in relation to these issues. So connecting to mainstream media outlets, while one of the stated objectives of the Arctic Council in relation to its social media posts was to increase information and engagement with journalists, that is to reach out to traditional media or legacy media. But unfortunately, it didn't reach that purpose. It did not materialize as they made the issue and mission for themselves. Twitter and Facebook posts were rarely shared by national and or local media outlets, and they did not make use of tagging, which is commonly used in social media, placing the username in the body of the post or tweet in order to reach the target audience. And the council very rarely shared any articles or material produced by external media companies, local, regional, or national. So conclusions, what can we make of this? It raises more questions than answers, actually, this case study. What does the use of social media by the Arctic Council tell us about the relationship between science diplomacy, technology, and the public sphere? What conclusions can be drawn and what lessons might be learned from this case study and the ways in which they use social media? Conclusion one, I would say, as I referred to at the beginning, media ecology. Media ecology as a concept encourages scholars to consider the total communicative makeup of a given media environment and the relationship between the different components of that environment rather than looking at each communicative form, act, medium in isolation. They are very much linked and related. So we have to understand that in its totality rather than just considering each medium in isolation. And it's becoming more and more important, as we know, in politics too. It's impossible to think about politics, geopolitics without thinking about the communication and mediation media environment. So far, they did not make their social media accounts important nodes, and much wider communicative network became very isolated, only targeted a niche audience, again, which were already informed about what was going on, but not to the larger public who are the stakeholders, of course, the social stakeholders. There was lack of engagement and interaction with local, regional, and national media outlets. It could have been actually very functional and useful if it were used in that capacity, and it made their role in the broader media ecology somewhat peripheral. It stayed peripheral rather than central. It was more of a node in specialized communicative, diplomatic, and scientific communication ecology. Conclusion 2, disintermediation. This is a very specific term also in media communication studies. The extent to which individuals or organizations utilize platforms to describe what disintermediation is, such as social media to bypass mainstream media in order to reach the general population, or conversely, the extent to which they use or rely upon the mainstream media for the spread and amplification of their messaging. That's what disintermediation is. So their use of social media showed little evidence of an attempt, again, so far. This is not to discredit what they were trying to do in their efforts, but this is what the case study showed, to include mainstream media outlets in their posts or to encourage amplification of their messages on science diplomacy through direct or indirect social media contact. Because it's, even though social media and alternative forms of communication are very prominent nowadays, it doesn't mean traditional media are unimportant. They are still very big players, actually, and there's a lot of interaction between alternative social media outlets and traditional media outlets. So at the end, I would say whether this practice is intentional or unintentional, because when I did the study, I actually contacted their communication officers and I explained what the study was about. And I wanted to interview them to include that in the case study, but they did not get back. So, conclusion 3, I would say technological determinism and solutionism. That is, technology is used because it's there, and not using it would therefore seems like a failure. So every organization, every institution uses these platforms. And that second, that mere use of the technology will solve problems, which it doesn't. Yes, they put information out there and it'll be found by those who are interested. But the technology not only offers solutions to every problem that we have, in this case, reaching youth or indigenous communities or other social stakeholders, but that the creators of technology generate false problems. I would say, I'm talking about big tech here, can then only be solved by the technology that they create. So we are, I teach environmental communication at my home university, Stockholm University, and the students who are coming from all over the world, actually, every term I get 70, 80 students, they use a lot of different means of communication, one being, for instance, music, like rap music about social issues, environmental issues, museums, even street art and other means of communication. And I think my criticism here is toward media and communication studies, because media became very central, especially in the 1990s after the internet became like a major medium, and communication fell off the map. So we forgot about communication, but we focused on media, digital media, and that form of mediation, because we communicate in other forms, in face-to-face, and as I said, museums, etc. So that was not sort of taken into consideration for almost 2 decades, actually, which is, I think, prominent, but it's sort of like coming back to the map again, thankfully. So a narrow technological determinist or solutionist view, therefore, might serve to hinder more open, progressive, alternative modes of communicating science and science diplomacy. So social media is not necessarily the only way to communicate this, but there are other ways of reaching out to the public and informing social stakeholders and making them aware of what's going on in relation to science and science diplomacy, because they are the voters and they are, in a way, the most important stakeholders in this case. Conclusion 4, I would say the public sphere and social media. Where are the public and the social in this case? Science diplomacy communicated by Arctic Circle centers around the region facing potentially disastrous consequences, not only in the Arctic or not only in that region, obviously globally. And science diplomacy in question and the science that may spring from or through that diplomacy has clear material implications for large numbers of people living in situations marked by extreme precarity. So in that sense, I would say using communication more novelly, or finding ways to reach out to these communities and to the social stakeholders, citizens, communities, youth in particular, is really, really important. And just use of social media is not really serving that purpose. And there is, I would say, lack of contact, relative lack of contact and engagement with broader publics about science diplomacy and what's happening in that field. So on the whole, linkages between science, diplomacy, technology, and ethical responsibilities of citizenship and democracy are the things that need to be emphasized and taught about. As I said at the beginning, this is it brings up more questions than answers. So questions that might pop up in relation to this case study and similar other studies, which are many, would be: how might organizations involved in the communication of science diplomacy better leverage the possibilities and affordances available through social media platforms and other communication venues? How might the interactive features of those same platforms be harnessed to stimulate debate both inside and outside of science diplomacy circles? Where does science diplomacy fit in the ecology network, media ecology and communication ecology network? And how might techno-romantic and techno-deterministic frameworks actually hinder a comprehensive understanding of the functioning of that media and communication ecology? And to what extent are social media platforms seen within science diplomacy circles as tools for bypassing mainstream media in order to reach a broader public? Again, this in relation to disintermediation versus as tools for reaching mainstream media for further amplification. this is what I'm going to end up with. And this is a painting by Salvador Dali. And I used this last year during my short talk at the Arctic Circle Assembly. Let me first tell you what the painting is. It's called Geopolitical Child Watching the Birth of the New Man. It's a 1943 painting. And he's basically describing how the world is being reshaped after World War II. Of course, the United States rising as even bigger power as a result of this. So I'll go back to the picture, but there's a man coming out of an egg and a gender ambiguous adult and child looking on. There are several interpretations of that. Some say it's Mother Mary and Jesus, and some others have other interpretations of that particular imagery. And he provided some abbreviated, mysterious notes about work, parachute, paranescence, protection, cupola, placenta, Catholicism, egg, earthly distortion, biological ellipse. What basically, what he said in relation to his painting was geography changes its skin in historic germination. So I want to end with this. I'm in the habit of liking analogies, and I like this particular one. Obviously, what's happening today, what we're witnessing, not only in relation to the Arctic, but the world is changing. The face of science diplomacy is changing. Geopolitics is changing. Here are the gender non-specific person and the child. And in the background, there's a couple dancing, actually. It's also telling, right? It's basically saying the world, I mean, we had the World War II, disasters happened, but some are still dancing and are happy out there. And then the man in the middle is representing the United States. I'm not suggesting that's what's happening right now, but this is an analogy to sort of use in relation to how everything is changing and how we can study these things and see what's coming, because we're witnessing so many changes. But I will stop here, and I will thank you for listening, and I will give the word to Rasmus for the rest of the session.